Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session of assignment discussion on the research project unit. Now, as we've been covering, this particular unit in the last few weeks, we have come to the last stage of our discussion, which is to look at deconstructing the assignment brief and go about, obviously achieving this unit. Now, what I've done here is I've got the assignment brief and I've also got a presentation slide in which we'll be using this to basically do the discussion on how to look at doing the assignment, for this particular unit. Now, just briefly, if I show my full screen, what I want to be able to do is obviously show you everything with regards to what we have discussed so far on this unit. And, going forward, we would want to do is basically look at discussing the assignment brief, which will allow us to essentially, complete this particular unit. Now, I've got a couple of things open on my screen, which I want to actually share with you so that systematically we can relate to everything that we are going to be covering. So I have got, let me just organize this very briefly. There we go. So now what I'll do is I'll quickly share my full screen and you should be able to see pretty much everything that we need to have and discuss for this particular session. Now, as you're aware that this is a unit that we started off, a couple of weeks back, and the idea here was to try and understand the importance of research in health and social care sector. So the first document that I have here is primarily related to the unit specification, and this is something that we have followed through pretty much in our discussions when we've done the discussions of the LO, LO1, LO2, LO3, and LO4. Now, this is the assignment brief, which has been released by, ATHE, and this is something which everybody would need to, obviously go ahead and do. And this particular assignment brief primarily would be discussed today in our session. The reason they call it a sample assignment brief is because in this case, the project would essentially be decided in conjunction with the tutor, which is myself. So you would need to send across a research proposal, a one-page proposal that will help us agree on what kind of a topic or a project you would undertake for completing this unit. On this side, I've got the third document, which is called the research proposal. And this is what I'd initially shared during my discussions of the learning outcome. And the idea of having this research proposal was to try and give you a bit of project specification or an outline of how to go about conducting research. And this is a good combination of, talking about things like the title of the project, rationale of the research that you're going to undertake, aims and objectives, which and what are the sources that you're going to look for in terms of doing or conducting the literature review, briefly about research methodology, the references that you're going to look at, whether it's data coming from common reports, different websites, published articles, journals. And the idea was to generally look at compiling this into a bit of a schema or an outline of what your research project will look like. And this is what will establish essentially your assignment with regards to the evidence that you'll submit for this unit. And on this side, I've got the PowerPoint presentation, which is where I've converted this particular assignment brief into a presentation for us to basically discuss this in a bit more detail so that you are able to complete and achieve this unit. So what I've done is I will discuss some of these tasks and relate them to, the discussions that we've done in the learning outcome presentations. So these are the 4 documents I would suggest that you would need in order for you to be able to complete this particular unit and submit the assignment successfully. Now, this is a 20 credit assignment as against some of the other units, which are 15 credit. This is a 20 credit unit. There is a pass mark only for this unit. And the idea would be to try and, look at the assignment brief and then discuss in order to, submit this assignment, I would say just before Christmas so that you're able to, complete and achieve this unit. Now, I would take you back to the assignment brief pretty much straight away. The reason being, it will be easier for you to see, each of these documents on the screen. Now, just very briefly, the assignment brief, as you can see, talks about to achieve this unit, you have to formulate a research specification. That means you have to produce a plan and essentially carry out the research project. Now, while carrying out this research plan and the project, by compiling a report, you would need to be able to then address some of the areas or tasks which have been given in this assignment brief. So there are one, task 2, and task 3 and 4, which correspond to the 4 learning outcomes on the unit specification. And what they've done is they've basically broken down these tasks into recognizable chunks which relate directly to the assessment criteria and the coverage that we've done in the discussion of the learning outcome presentations. Now, for the purposes of our discussion, what I've done is I've primarily converted this, copied and pasted, and obviously gleaned some of the main points of the assignment brief into a presentation. And this is what we are going to be looking at discussing in today's session, which is the assignment discussion session. Now, for those of you who are looking at, obviously, for you who would be submitting this as the first assignment, my suggestion essentially would be to look at ensuring that you are essentially, let's put it this way, following some of the tips which we can essentially, I'm going to essentially discuss, and they would help formulate, good structured, report, when you submit this assignment for the purposes of feedback and evaluation. So, first things first, if I look at taking you through briefly some of the basic essentials which are required, we know that the aim of this project unit, studying this unit, was to understand why research is important in the health and social care sector. Some of the important points which I would suggest that you need to be aware of when you are looking at compiling a Word document or a research project report would be to be specific about an organization to start. The reason I would say this is because your topic has to be specific to a particular organization that you're trying to research, and hopefully the selection of the organization has to be done in a way wherein you have access to the data, at least from a secondary perspective, from the website, from published reports or things like that, which are in the public domain, so that you are able to collate the data for the purposes of presentation analysis, for the purposes of collation analysis, and then presentation of your results and conclusions. Now, I would be strongly advised that when you start a research project, the idea of forming the research proposal or the research project specification is to basically describe the background in terms of why you're looking at undertaking this research. When you obviously look at writing the report up, I would suggest give proper headings, use the use table of contents, create subheadings for your for various sections of the report, and then general guidelines when you submit assignments is that you're looking at least 12 to 15 references for the research project report, which could be a combination of books, articles, journals, websites that you are essentially referring for the purposes of gathering data. Make sure your assignment is referenced in Harvard referencing style. You are in places paraphrasing if you're taking the text from different sources. Make sure your plagiarism is within the 20% limit. I would suggest that the word limit given by ATHE is about 2,500 words, but considering that if some of you are doing the first research project, I would say that the word limit could be anywhere up to 3,500 limits for you to be able to justify the 5 sections of the report that you would need to compile your research project in. And obviously, there is no grading in this particular course, so obviously the pass grade would mean that you've achieved 100%. The other bit that I would just briefly mention this to you is that there is an assignment declaration form, which obviously you would need to submit along with the assignment. And this form basically consists of you writing your name, registration number, the name of the unit, and obviously confirming by checking the boxes, some of the terms and conditions, things like you're referencing all the sources that have been used in your assignment. You're not colluding with somebody. You're making sure that are giving credit to authors, publishers, or essentially people who have been credited, for writing or publishing that work, and you're bringing that in your, if you're using that work in your own report, then you have to definitely reference it. Just make sure that you're not using or submitting something which is secondary plagiarized, and then towards the end, you need to sign the declaration. Now, in order to go back into the discussion of the assignment, if we look at briefly the assignment scenario, which has been given by ATHE, here what they have suggested is that we need to look at formulating a research project specification. So that's the key bit that we have to look at. That means a research proposal has to be made, and a research proposal has to be made by giving proper credence to having topics, having basically certain headings like the topic of the research project, the rationale of the research project, the aims and objectives, a timeline or a Gantt chart essentially showing how long will it be, how would you go about completing the project or compiling the report, and then towards the end, what could be the findings and conclusions that you're expecting to draw from the research that you're going to undertake. So this bit has to be, I would say, the research proposal. And this is something which I've discussed, and I mentioned that there are two useful sites that you could look at essentially, and these two sites would help you pick out a suitable report or a topic in the of your interest. And using that report, what I would suggest is go about compiling this as a secondary research project. Now, at this stage, I am not expecting you to go into and do some fieldwork or collect data through primary research. So essentially, the idea would be to try and shortlist a report from the two websites, which I'm going to show you next in the next slide, and then basically choose a topic of your interest, and then download that report. And from that report, you're going to be looking at finalizing the 5 aspects, of writing your own research report. Now, these two sites that I mentioned earlier is one is the Health Foundation and the other is the NHS website, from which you can download research projects which have been carried out by various teams within the NHS and the Department of Health, and they could be, useful reports for you to be able to go about and essentially look at, choosing a topic of your interest and then carrying out a research. Now, very briefly, I would show these two sites to you so that it is something which is fresh and you are aware that this is a site that you need to be able to look at for you to be able to go about and obviously downloading a particular research report. So let me just quickly switch you over for the purposes of showing these sites to you. So these are the two sites. One of them is basically the Health Foundation, as you can see, and there you can research or browse research project reports by various topics. So choose the topic of your interest, go in and download that report. The most important point here is that you would need to download that report and submit that report along with the Word document or the research that you are compiling as an evidence assignment for this particular unit, so that I'm able to correlate this is the report and this is the output that you have been able to produce. Obviously, when you download this report, you're going to be looking at paraphrasing, referencing a lot of data content that you're going to be taking from this report. So go about, spend about half an hour or so and look at the various different forms of reports on this site and also the topics of interest. And download one report, one topic of interest, and that is what you're going to be then putting it into a research proposal and later on into an assignment as far as the research is concerned. And this is a good site again, which is the Scottish Government NHS website, wherein obviously there are lots of research reports which have been published by topic. You click on this and you can actually go into a particular topic. So for example, there are loads of it which they have published. So if I go into health and social care, which is the specific area that I want to focus on, and then what I would want to do is basically from here, choose a specific topic of research which I want to do, for example, Scottish schools, or Scottish Health Survey. And if I click on this, some of these obviously you will have to go through, browse and see that they are of useful interest and there is meaningful data in terms of the reports which are currently available. So when we look at clicking on the reports, you will see a lot of these reports to come up. You need to choose only one. As I mentioned again, you need to choose only one. So for example, here the topic research report is mental health and well-being. So if I click on this, this is a research report which was published in January 2015. The extracts of the report are given here. If you want to download all the documents, which is what you would need to do so for doing this as your research specification, then you need to click on it and then basically open this report up and download it so that you save it on your on your PC, and then you're going to reference sections of this report essentially to be able to go about writing your own research project. So here, if I show you how I'm doing it, I will go about copying the topic of the report, save it, and then save it on my PC. And then I have a copy of this report available for me to be able to go about writing my research report. Now, the reason of doing this is because we are looking at doing secondary research, And when you look at secondary research, you're going to be looking at collating data from the report and then bringing it into your assignment report for the purposes of completing this unit. Now, as you would recall, now, if I just briefly switch you over to the research topic proposal, you would recall that there were 5 chapters in which essentially I mentioned in our discussion on learning outcome 4, how do you present a report? How do you compile a research report? So there are 5 chapters. Essentially, you start off with the introduction. Before the introduction would come the proposal or the research project specification, which is something that we need to do in task 1. And after that, you'd look at formulating that into 5 chapters like introduction, research methodology, literature review, your data collation, analysis and finding. And then towards the end, you present your conclusions, recommendations, and areas of future research. So this report that you downloaded is about a 78-page report. We are going to be taking out and extracting material from here. Most of it is going to be paraphrasing because you're going to be reading this report first, and then writing the summary of this research project in your own words in about 2,500 to 3,500 words. Parts of this report will be utilized as screenshots when you present your data, or when you present, say, for example, graphs, charts, and analysis. They are going to be screenshots of this, because that is where you will look at presenting your findings. So some bits of this would be taken, this report will be directly taken, but sections of the report that you take out are going to be paraphrased and obviously referenced. The bibliography towards the end of this report is going to be quite important, because the content that you take from this report and include it in your assignment is going to be referenced by including the references from here as well. So again, I'm repeating, this is going to be a desk-based research or a secondary research approach. Should you wish to do a primary research, please include that in your proposal. I'm not saying that you should not do a primary research, but considering that the primary research would involve collection of data, meeting participants, sending out survey questionnaires, then anonymizing the data, things like that, it would be more time consuming. And considering that some of you, obviously are working, so obviously there is no mandatory requirement for somebody to be able to do a primary research or undertake a primary research project. It is not a mandatory requirement in the assignment. So essentially, the idea would be to try and look at a desk-based approach, which is secondary research, wherein you are going to be collating data, and then using a report, a specific research report, to be able to write your assignment. Now, if I switch you now back to the research specification, the presentation, and what we want to be able to do is discuss how would you go about writing the research report. Now, the first task basically talks about you completing a research project specification. Now, for this, if you go on to Moodle, and I will bring this up right now, as you would recall, I had shared a research proposal template with you, which is on your screen now. This research proposal template is the template that is going to be used to formulate your research project specification. So tasks 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4 will essentially be covered if you complete this research proposal template. Now, the first part is it talks about formulating and recording and project specification. So this particular template is a project specification template, which is for your research project. The second part it talks about is you have to look at writing a research question, which means you have to discuss about what is the title of your research report going to be, what is the rationale of your research, and what are the aims and objectives of your research. And then you'll need to write the purpose of your research, what could be the possible outcomes that you're looking at in terms of uncovering when you complete this research project, what could be the ethical issues which are towards the end, ethical considerations that you have to look at, and what would be the research methodology that you're going to use. In this case, it is going to be a secondary methodology. It could be a combination of qualitative, quantitative. So you have to write about the research strategy and the methodology here in a few words, 20 to 30 words. And then towards the end, it asks you to compile a bibliography or basically a list of references, sites from which this data has been collated for the purposes of your research. Now, if I go about and obviously show this to you as a full screenshot, so that you are able to place this into context in terms of what we are discussing. If you see this now, what you will be able to see is that when you see the whole screen, it talks about research question, purpose of research, potential research outcomes, consideration of ethical issues, methodology, and bibliography. All this is covered in this research proposal template. So what we are doing is we are formulating and recording a specification for what the research will be. So in this case, I've given you an example that the impact of disability in the life of young children, which is the title of my research project. Which organization or why am I doing this? I'm going to look at studying the impact of disability of lives of young children. And this is for data which is coming in from the NHS. I've looked at this specific area wherein I'm going to look at I've downloaded this report and I'm going to be looking at conducting my research on this report. Now, I'm going to be looking at stating the aims and objectives, which are going to come from the research report itself. The purpose of research is given in the abstract or the background of the research report. What are the specific area of focus of research? The specific focus of research is to look at, how disability affects parent-child relationship. What are the key points of interest or issues? They will also come across from the background, which has been explained in that report. And then what is the broader significance of this report? So there is this research project has been undertaken because the NHS in Scotland wants to understand a specific relationship between people who have disabilities, and if they have not been given adequate support in the early years of their life, their development gets hampered, and they generally do not grow up to be as normal individuals. So that's the broader significance, and what they're trying to establish is that how can these areas, which is people with disability, get additional support so that they develop, grow up and develop into normal, healthy individuals. Now, the review of literature is going to come from these articles, the existing studies, and the published research or government reports, which are already there in that report that I've downloaded. And that summary is what you need to mention in terms of what parameters or arguments or broader areas that are going to be used to study, and then bring across a discussion on the relationship between disability and young people's life, and how it affects, how the disability affects the young people's life when they grow up as individuals. That has to be brought across in the literature review. The methodology in this case for the research report has been primary. So they have gone about collecting data from 5,000 participants in Scotland, young people with disabilities, and they have then analyzed that data to come out with findings. Now, the sources of information are going to come from the areas in which they have gone about doing the research or collecting the data, and this will come across from the bibliography in the from the report. Results and conclusion towards the end are very clearly given in chapter 5 of the report, and that is what you need to summarize. I would suggest in your case, when you download a particular report of your interest and topic, and then look at compiling this research specification. And then you have to look at putting down some of the ethical considerations which have been discussed in the report, limitations of research, and they have to be compiled here as bullet points to give a sense and idea that you understand when we carry out research, there are sometimes going to be limitations or constraints, and these constraints, if they are not overcome, can affect the outcome of the research project or the report. And those important considerations that are taken into account for carrying out the research have to be mentioned here. Now, this particular document would cover your tasks 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4, and this needs to be compiled as a start to begin with when you start doing your project. Now, task 1.5, as you can see, basically talks about an appropriate plan or a process which has been agreed. And this is where I would suggest you need to start looking at putting down a timeline. Now, when I look at putting down a timeline, what I mean by that is that you would need to put out an example of a Gantt chart. And as you can see, which I pulled it out here, it basically presents the whole project that you're going to do in 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, whatever the time frame. But what you do is you divide the main areas of your research into subtopics or 5 chapters, essentially, I would say, and then you assign how much time you're going to spend on each of these to be able to complete the project and compile the report. And this is normally emphasized as what is called a timeline, and that is your task 1.5. So provide an appropriate plan and a procedure for agreed research specification. That is a timeline, a specific tasks which are given here, which are on the left, the sequence in which these will be completed, what is the time that you're spending in terms of weeks or days, and then what are the key milestones that you plan to achieve before you actually start your next task or next major task on the timeline is supposed to be completed, and how will the research be monitored. So if you sometimes look at when researchers can go about collecting data or go about doing these series of activities for the purposes of compiling research, collecting data, sometimes they overshoot the time or go beyond the timelines which have been set. So here what you would do is basically have this as a timeline for the overall project, and this would be relevant so that you are able to then perform most of the activities within the time frame that you have defined. And if there are activities which are requiring more time to be spent on them, then in those cases either they will be included as constraints or limitations to the research, or in some cases what you will do is go about amending the timeline so that you are able to spend adequate resources and time to be able to collect and analyze the data which is required or which will be vital for the drawing the conclusions or the outcomes of your research. And this timeline that you present would be essentially meeting the task 1.5. Now, if I go into task 3 of the assignment report, which is here, which basically talks about implement the research project in accordance with the agreed specification, and you need to be able to show that you have been able to record and collate all relevant data through the research. So here, what I would suggest is that is where your downloaded research report would come in handy. So what we are looking at doing here is basically looking at going into the main part, which is talking about, essentially the, bit on data collation, collection, analysis, and presentation of the findings. So if I go into details of this report, say, for example, if this is what I would have looked at. So aims of the report, when you look at research specification, will come from here, background of research will come from here. Some of the arguments that are being built for literature review are going to come from here, as you can see. And this will nicely lead us into limitations of the research or ethical considerations and the literature review. And these are the factors which are being considered for the purposes of drawing up arguments in terms of why these factors are important, which need to be considered in order to draw meaningful conclusions. Things like socio-demographic factors, lifestyle factors, health conditions, and they would help contribute towards methodology, research literature review. Now, methodology, as you have seen, they have mentioned that they've collected data across 2 years to be able to include the data from sample size, which is primary, and then they've used advanced statistical techniques like logistics, regression analysis to be able to come out with meaningful conclusions from the data which has been collected from participants over a period of 2 years. Now, the last part that we are going to look at, which is the task 3, is basically collation of these findings and presentation of data and the results. So what I would suggest here is, just as an example, in the literature review, there are 4 broad points which have been taken: socio-demographic factors, they've taken income, health conditions, lifestyle, and health behaviors. Now, these 3 have been essentially, then analyzed by doing analysis of the data which has been collected from participants. So there's a questionnaire towards the end, and that questionnaire, when the responses have been collated, and they have then been presented in terms of what you call findings for this research. So you would need to take out some screenshots from here, take some screenshots, and they will need to be included in your report in order to basically present the findings of what the report has been able to uncover. Now, I would suggest that you are not looking at presenting findings of more than 2 pages. So my suggestion on the research report that you download, sometimes these reports are quite detailed. So my suggestion would be to try and limit your aims and objectives to 1 or 2, so that when you are reading this report, you're only focused on those 1 or 2 objectives, and they will then be presented in the form of graphs, tables, screenshots that you take from the research report in terms of findings for your research. And then once you have done this, And then towards the end, what you would do is basically go into what are called the conclusions and recommendations. So what you would then see is the results are also being presented towards the end of the report. These results you will need to read and then compile, not compile, these results I would suggest you read, and then with the one or two objectives that you've taken from the report, you relate them specifically to those objectives, rather than looking at all the results, because the report would be a very large report. And in some cases, if it has more than 4 or 5 objectives, there's no point in collating it, because we have to keep in mind the word limit of the assignment that we are also going to do, so which is 2.5 to 3,500 words. So limit your results to the 2 or 3 objectives that you have looked at the start of your research specification, and then collate them, write them, draw them down into the report by presenting the findings, briefly covering the results, and then conclude by making a summary in terms of what the research report has been able to accomplish. And that would help complete tasks 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 3.1, 3.2, and 3.3. The reason I say this is because at some stage, when you look at this part of the report, you're going to be structuring your, let's put it this way, your report into essentially, these, I would say, 5 broad chapters. So when you look at these 5 broad chapters, what you're looking at is essentially, making sure that at some stage you are looking at compiling the research report from, your assignment from the research report, which has been essentially downloaded. And then the presentation of this has to be done essentially using these 5 chapters. So what I would suggest is look at introduction, not more than 300 to 500 words, aims and objectives, not more than 2. I would say not more than 2 aims or objectives to be taken, so I would recommend limiting it to that. In literature review, you're looking at summarizing the main sources from which the information has been taken, and the main sources from which the information has been taken needs to be compiled, in about 300 to 500 words, or 500 to 700 words. You should include ethical considerations in about 200 words maximum. Then research methodology, you have to define the research strategy. What is the methodology of carrying out that project, of that research, essentially in about 300 to 500 words. And then conclusions on that piece, on conclusions to be drawn from the research report that you have downloaded. And this would essentially be, about 300 to 500 words. And when you do all this, you are looking at then writing a report which is meeting the specification and the criteria asked by ATHE, which is 2,500 words minimum, as a minimum. So if I add 500 and say 750, that's 1250, 1450, you're looking at about 500, which is about 1950 and about 2450. So give or take, you're looking at roughly, I would say anywhere between 2,500 to 3,500 words to be able to compile a research report. And that would achieve your task 4, which is presentation of your research findings in a professionally structured, formatted report, which covers these 5 chapters essentially. And then I would suggest towards the end in the appendix, definitely see and add the questionnaire if it is made available. If it is available, then add the questionnaire which was used to collect the data, which is, from the report. So add anything which is useful in terms of future, areas of research, or anything which you feel is a particular important part of the research report that you have read, that could be included as an annexure towards the end, so that it allows, for us to have a good understanding. Now, typically in annexures, what is normally put in the end of the research report? You normally put your calculations, the data that you've collected, any advanced statistical techniques that you use for the purposes of data calculation analysis, things like regression analysis. Then you add questionnaires or participant information sheets, how the questionnaire or survey was sent out, those kind of bits. are included, towards the end in terms of your research report. And do not forget bibliography, which needs to be there, and references which need to be there in the end of your research report, and they need to be at least 10 to 15 references in order to ensure that you have justified and given credit to the people from which or research report from which you have taken the data for your assignment. Now, some useful tips which I normally always provide is that focus on the tasks essentially, and how much to write and how much is too much or how much is too less. I think you should focus on what is called the command verb. So in some cases, in some of the tasks, you would see it will say, it would basically talk about provide or create or formulate, so or undertake. That means some of these command verbs will need to be looked at, wherein you're not theoretically covering them up. This is a practical unit. So obviously in this case, you have to create most of the stuff to be able to present, the research report. And as I mentioned to you earlier, some part of it is to look at giving it proper headings and do the compilation of your report in these 5 chapters. So they are properly, they have proper headings and subheadings that it's easy to recognize when you complete your research project report. Now, what I also want to do is basically show you an example report in terms of how the research assignment report is to be presented. And the reason of doing this is just to give you an idea that this is something that you will look at when you present your own research report for the purposes of evaluation. So here is what I would do is show you a report. Obviously, this is something which one of the learners has submitted, and they have, as you can see, structured the document in a way wherein, essentially it includes basic things like, headings, page numbers, for example, things like, subheadings. Tasks have been clearly written out. So task 1, research project specification, obviously an introduction to the research project in terms of what the research has been. So in this case, the learner has carried out a research project which basically looks at measurement of stress management techniques in a public sector enterprise, specifically in a thermal power project corporation. Obviously, some of the details have been formulated using own defined format. So research population, which includes a bit of a background on the organization, introduction, the research aims, objectives, the questions which are going to be investigated in this research. Why is the research project being done? The rationale has been explained briefly. And what are the evidences which are going to be reviewed in terms of literature which is already present in and about the field of stress management, and some of the key literature which will be utilized and brought into for the purposes of carrying out this review has been briefly mentioned in terms of how the literature review is going to be done. And then the research report goes about, in the introduction part on the project specification, talks about what areas of the research it is going to uncover, what could be the possible conclusions, if there are any assumptions which are being made, and then towards the end, what kind of conclusions the researcher plans to draw or would see being drawn are mentioned in this particular specification. And then what he's gone in and done is basically gone about taking up the tasks and looking at research project specification, which was a part and parcel of the bit which have been covered in the assignment brief. So they've gone about talking about critical references, research project specification, methodology, as you can see, and then a timeline to see what is the timeline in which this research is going to be accomplished. Then gone into task 2 to understand research project specification, related it to research design, method of data collection, and then basically sampling technique, which is the methodology of either looking at primary, secondary, and then collection of data, presentation of findings, how they have been collated using tables, graphs, charts, and they have been presented. And then towards the end, research outcome and limitations of this research have been covered. And then the findings have been collated. Key findings have been presented. The discussion around the findings with the relation and relating it to the aims and objectives which the researcher actually started off with the project have been discussed very briefly. And then towards the end, recommendations have been made in terms of what the organization needs to do in order to reduce and manage stress management techniques, or using stress management techniques for its employees and workers. And then a conclusion for the project has been drawn, and a bibliography has been included towards the end of the research project. This particular report is primarily about 3,100 words, which the learner has compiled, and it is well within the particular requirement of the research report requirement of ATHE. So this is a good example, which I'm also going to upload primarily on the Moodle, so that you are able to see and get a reference of it, should you wish to do so, in order to understand how a research report needs to be essentially compiled. So I would suggest that this is something that I would suggest at some stage you go about looking at, just for the purposes of ideation. And once you've looked at this is then going to be useful for you to be able to go about and presenting your own research assignment. So I hope this session has been useful, and you have been able to understand how to produce the assignment for this particular unit. And I would suggest that when I look at the submission of this assignment, I would suggest that you are looking at presenting and submitting this towards, if I have to give you a timeline for submission, I would say you are looking at submitting this by, say, 21st December 2023, which would help us complete this unit, and obviously look at making sure that when you come back in the new year, you have completed and achieved this unit, and then some of you would have completed your course as well. So I hope this session has been useful. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to take them now. And the presentation, the research proposal, specification, and also this sample research project is going to be available on the website for you to be able to refer. And feel free to refer to this particular sample for the purposes of compiling your own research report. And if you have any questions, or if you think of any questions, feel free to come back to me via email on learnerwork@ukversity.co.uk or raman@ukversity.co.uk. Thank you so much for joining, and I will catch up with you next week, where we'll be looking at starting the next unit on this particular course. Until then, thank you and bye for now.